All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we are exploring one of the most, frankly, radical psychological reinterpretations of a famous historical narrative. We're looking at Carl Jung's take on the story of Jesus in the wilderness. See, Jung didn't just view this as some ancient theology. No, he saw it as a profound, highly practical psychological map for confronting what he called the shadow. Basically, surviving the intense temptations of power and hunger out in a barren wasteland was, in Jung's eyes, the ultimate test of human individuation.
So I want to start by asking you a question right out of the gate. Are you fighting the wrong war? Like, really pause and be brutally honest with yourself for a second here. How much of your daily life is spent fighting external enemies? Think about it. Arguing with strangers on the internet, complaining about corrupt institutions, raging at politicians, or blaming the system. Are you doing all of this just so you don't have to sit in silence and actually face your own internal chaos?
Because here's the thing. Pointing the finger outward, it's a massive, dangerous illusion. We're constantly taught that our greatest battles are against the systems that oppress us or the people who wrong us. But if you're constantly pointing that finger outward, you're entirely losing what we might call the invisible war. Jung believed the only war that actually matters is happening entirely inside of you. When you're busy pointing outward, you're completely missing the true battlefield.
Which brings us to Section 1, the external enemy illusion.
Jung believed the human psyche isn't some peaceful sanctuary. It's a literal battlefield. He looked at the life of Jesus of Nazareth and noted that, within this psychological framework, Jesus wasn't fighting Rome or the Pharisees or some political structure. He was fighting something far older and far darker, which is the collective shadow of humanity itself. So the enemy isn't external, it's the shadow. Now, what's really interesting here is how this defines the parts of ourselves we spend our whole lives running from. The shadow is the unconscious part of the psyche containing literally everything society, family, and religion have deemed unacceptable. We're talking about your deepest rage, your ruthless ambition, your insatiable hunger. We spend our lives so terrified of this shadow that we project it onto total strangers, or we just try to drown it out in our daily routines. To fix this fragmentation, Jung introduced this concept of individuation. This is the psychological process where a fragmented human being finally stops running and becomes a unified, integrated whole. But let me tell you, achieving this wholeness is not easy. It requires you to stop the projection entirely. Instead of blaming the world, you actually have to descend into your own unconscious and meet that dark shadow face to face.
And that takes us right into Section 2, driven into the wilderness.
Jung saw Jesus as the very first human being to consciously and publicly complete this individuation process, showing us exactly what psychological wholeness actually requires. And notice, this journey does not begin in a place of comfort. It always begins in a terrifying psychological desert. Just look at the specific wording in the historical text. The Spirit drives him into the desert. It doesn't gently lead him. It doesn't politely invite him. It drives him. This forceful language of compulsion is absolutely crucial. If you've ever genuinely begun the psychological journey of individuation, you know exactly what this means. The psyche literally drags you into this confrontation against your conscious will. You get stripped of your familiar identities, your social roles, the whole shebang.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast between superficial spa day spirituality and the brutal reality of genuine psychological awakening. I mean, look at modern spirituality today. It's often this massive industry of comfort, right? Billions of dollars spent on meditation apps, lavender essential oils, good vibes only retreats. But Jungian psychology? It's about wandering into a desolate desert and wrestling your own personal demons for 40 days. If your spiritual awakening feels totally comfortable, you aren't waking up. You're just taking a nap. Genuine awakening is brutal, and it's incredibly isolating.
So let's move to Section 3, confronting the inner shadow. Let's look closely at those 40 days in the desert. In biblical symbolism, the wilderness is really a landscape of the inner world. The adversary Jesus faces isn't some external monster with horns. It's his own inner shadow. Let's break down these specific temptations, because the shadow is essentially asking the ultimate question. Who are you really, underneath the hunger and the uncertainty? First, the shadow offers bread, which maps directly to the ego's desperate desire for physical survival. Next, it offers power over all the kingdoms of the world. That aligns perfectly with the ego's deepest fantasy of total control. And finally, the temptation of testing God, pushing the divine to prove itself. You see, the shadow knows exactly where the ego is most vulnerable.
So the absolutely crucial point here is how we respond to these temptations. Most of us, when faced with the agonizing pressure of our shadow,
Well, we try to negotiate with it. We surrender to the ego's demand for survival and control. Or, even worse, we suppress our dark desires entirely, just pretending they don't exist at all. But suppressing the shadow is a trap. It's a fundamental Jungian psychological principle that suppression creates neurosis. Suppressing your dark desires only leads to inner turmoil. It never, ever leads to growth.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, becoming radically unconditioned.
So what exactly is the solution to surviving this inner wilderness? Conscious confrontation and dialogue. You don't refuse the temptations by pretending they aren't there. You enter into a conscious confrontation with them. And when you survive that confrontation, something profound happens. You see this sharp contrast between the defended ego and the integrated self. The defended ego always operates from conditioning. It constantly requires social validation, needs approval, and calculates every single move based on what others will think. But contrast that with the integrated self. This state acts with total psychological sovereignty and radical freedom. It has absolutely zero need for that external validation.
You can actually see this integrated self in action through what Jung called externalized individuation. When you read the historical accounts through this psychological lens, you see a man operating completely outside of societal norms. After the desert, Jesus is touching lepers, speaking to women in public, eating with tax collectors and sinners. He deliberately approached the societal shadow figures, the untouchables of his day, specifically because he had already integrated his own internal darkness.
And this leads to an incredibly profound realization. The person who has done the brutal inner work can no longer project their darkness onto other people. Because of that, the phrase "love your enemies" is not some impossible moral instruction. It's actually an accurate psychological description of what life looks like after individuation. Once you do the brutal inner work and integrate your shadow, you have no darkness left to project. You literally stop seeing enemies, and you just start seeing human beings. The ego needs enemies to define itself, but the integrated self absolutely does not.
As we draw this explainer to a close, I want you to just sit with this warning from Carl Jung. The most dangerous thing a human being can do is to live an unlived life. Jung spent his entire life warning us about the absolute tragedy of merely performing, managing, and surviving without ever once descending into the depths of your true self. If you never face the shadow, you are literally living an unlived life.
The ultimate goal here is psychological sovereignty. We have to remember that the wilderness isn't a punishment. It's the necessary, unavoidable landscape where the false masks of the ego finally die and the radical freedom of a truly whole human being is born.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative challenge. Look at your life right now. Are you still standing at the edge of the desert, negotiating with your shadow, just hoping it's going to leave you alone? What is the wilderness that you are avoiding right now? It's time to stop waiting for comfort. Stop waiting for some external enemy to fight. Identify your inner chaos. Have the fierce courage to claim it and enter your desert.